In this video, Jordan Peterson talks about how every individual can contribute to the betterment of humanity.
It's a work in progress, so to speak, and that things might be as good as they can be because no one has figured out how to make them any better than they are. Now, I mean, that flies in the face of ideas of, the classical ideas of God, or that God's omniscient and omnipresent, and I always forget the other one. Yes, right, so the classic attributes of God is that he has all the power there is, and then of course the question is if that's the case, then why are things such a mess? And there's been various attempts to address that in the history of metaphysical and philosophical thought, and one is that they vary in degrees of complexity, but one is that, the world is set up such that human beings have to find their own way, that we have a role to play in this in some sense, although God could fix it if he wished. The other is that there was something went wrong near the beginning of time when people became, or at least the beginning of human time, when people became self-conscious, and that it's never been rectified. And the other is, and this is how it appears to me, is that it's something that has to be worked out as time progresses. That the nature of perfection can't be predetermined. It's too complex. And so in some sense that that being itself is an attempt to compute the perfect final solution, but that no one knows what that is, and that you can't compute it without running it as a simulation. It's something like that, and that we participate in that. And I believe that every time people make a choice, that the choice that you make is between tilting the world in a direction whose final destination would be something resembling hell, or tilting the world in a direction whose final destination would be something approximating heaven. And that you're always making that decision, and that you actually know that you're making that decision, and that you make it consciously at that point in time. And so I think then part of the moral duty of people is to put their lives together so that they're sufficiently without arrogance and sufficiently without resentment, so that every time they make a choice, they choose to push things in the right direction. That they're not vengeful and angry, and they're not out for destruction and revenge. And the part of the reason that I've come to this solution is because I've read what people who are extremely destructive think. And you can find those writings in various places. Some of the most illuminating forms of those writings I saw, for example, in the writings of the kid who shot up the Columbine High School. And he tells you exactly what he was thinking. It's very, very clear, and it's completely metaphysical. He explains it in religious language. He basically says that the world as presently constituted is so evil and so rife with suffering, including all of humanity, that it would be better if it was just wiped out. And that's what he proceeds to try to do. And his viewpoint is, of course, contaminated by the fact that he places himself not only above all other people, but above God himself, and then proceeds to be the judge and executioner. And I don't see how you can read what he said and not come to that conclusion. That's just exactly what he says. And the connection between that and the nature of the satanic impulse to rationally dominate and destroy are so close that they could have been formulated by the same thinker. And in some sense, I think they were. So, now, when God makes man and woman, a couple of things we talked about last time that I think are extremely interesting is that despite the fact that this book is so ancient, one of the propositions that it formulates is that both men and women are formulated in the image of God, which I think is quite remarkable. One of the things you always hear with regards especially to radical feminist thought, which is something that I think is destructive beyond comprehension, is that prior to the emergence of feminist thinking, the entire structure of humanity was basically patriarchal and aimed at oppressing women. And I don't think you can, and that was certainly the case for religious traditions like the great monotheisms, but I don't think that you can read Genesis and come to that conclusion, because one of the first statements is that both men and women are divine in their fundamental essence. And that is by no means a patriarchal statement. I think it's actually a miraculous statement in some sense that idea could have been formulated so early in time. And I think that says more about true nature of the historical relationship between men and women than any attempt to rewrite history across using some ideological, a priori ideological format. So men and women are both created, and then they're created in the image of God, whatever that means. I think it means that they have the capacity to turn possibility into actuality, and that's built into our being, and then they're placed in a garden. Now the idea of a garden is a very, very complicated idea, because the Garden of Eden is a particular type of place. And what it seems to me to be is that the story is not only describing archetypally what men and women are, but it's also describing archetypally what the environment of men and women has to be. And the environment has to be a garden, and a walled garden. And Eden means well-watered place, and paradise means walled garden. And so the idea that the semantic indicators point to is that the proper place for human beings is a place that's a combination of culture and nature, because the walls are there to protect and to keep in and to keep out, whereas the garden itself is the flourishing of nature in some independent manner, while also under the conscious apprehension and shaping of the inhabitants of that particular place. And I think that that's part of what human beings are struggling with right now. We're in the 21st century, and a big part of what faces us is, well, it appears that we have the ability, whether we want it or not, to shape the manner in which the entire planet manifests itself over the next endless span of time. And we're caught at the moment trying to decide exactly what that should look like. And whether we want the responsibility or not, it seems to be on us, and I would say that since it's on us, we should wake up and take the responsibility, because the thing will deteriorate of its own accord. And that means we have difficult decisions to make. And at the moment, we're mostly fighting about who's bad and who's good within that entire struggle, and looking for people to blame about why it's not as perfect as it could be. It's like there's a lot of reasons it's not as perfect as it could be, and I think that one of the most fundamental reasons is that none of your lives are as perfect as you could make them. And so because of that, you're not in any position to make the appropriate decisions that would have to be made in order to set the world on its proper course. Because it's a very complicated set of decisions, and that if you make a mistake because you're ideologically predisposed, or because your life is full of deceit and inadequacy, all of which you could conceivably address, then why do you think that you would be reliable enough to make the kind of decisions that would set things right? It's very, very complicated, and if we want to put the world in order, we're going to have to extend our capacity tremendously, because we're just not up to the task at the moment. It's not only that people won't do it, it's not only that people actively fight against making things better, it's also that we just don't know what to do. And it's a massive problem.